I mean, we have a little bit of his reaction already to this idea that he is, well, the proposed gag order. Listen to what Trump is already saying.
Did you see today that deranged Jack Smith, he's the prosecutor, he's a deranged person, wants to take away my rights under the First Amendment, wants to take away my right of speaking freely and openly.
So it's a little bit more complicated. He's being very reductive when he says just speaking openly and freely. He's not talking about his preferred, I don't know, latte in this fall. But he's talking about potentially, and he's being accused of maybe intimidating, threatening or otherwise. What do you say to that argument? Because obviously he is trying to put out there, they're trying to shut me down. It's a First Amendment issue.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Vita's exactly right that most defendants, this isn't a big deal. This is what's supposed to be done in a case to ensure that it's handled properly. The problem is, as Vita points out, he's running for office. And one of the key issues at issue in this campaign is, did he win the last election? Was he trying to influence the vice president to engage in illegal activity? Did he cause an insurrection? Those are all issues at stake in this election. And so he's not got a crazy point, but he can't intimidate witnesses because he's a presidential candidate. Doesn't give him the right to intimidate witnesses in an ongoing proceeding against him. So the judge is going to have to find some way of restricting him. The problem is, what's going to happen when he violates the order, which he's going to? Is she really going to impose sanctions? Is she going to put him in jail? I mean, that seems highly unlikely, and all that does, play right into his hands politically.
And by the way, she has already said to you, there is a chance if he engages in this behavior, this is Judge Shekin, she could move that trial date earlier. One of the issues is, and if you put back on the screen what is being asked for a moment from the special counsel, what they're trying to limit him, one of them involves statements regarding the identity, testimony, or credibility of prospective witnesses and beyond. There's an overlap. You're a member of the press. There's an overlap in terms of what's already publicly available in places like Georgia, by the way, where we know maybe grand juror information, et cetera. The taste and the appetite for information and what he would then build on. Is there a tension in your mind between what the press is trying to access and how he uses the information?
Well, I think even in this request for a gag order, there are provisions that he can quote from the public record and that he can make statements about his case. What they're trying to get him to do is prevent him from attacking individuals, whether it's the prosecutor, the judge, potential witnesses, or jurors. I also want to point out in Georgia, since you mentioned that case, as a condition of his bond agreement, he's under a similar gag order already. And I think it has, I'm not saying it's eliminated his criticism of some of the people involved in the Georgia case, but I don't think we've seen some of the rhetoric we saw from the president before that bond agreement. Now, again, the implications are a little bit different because, again, it's a condition of his bond. But it can happen. And I think most people who are facing a case aren't talking about the judge and the prosecutor on social media. They're probably not talking about the case much at all. There's a way for Donald Trump to move forward on social media if there's a gag order. The question is, will he comply?
I mean, we're looking at some examples right now. I mean, we've highlighted a portion of it. And by the way, this is the tip of the iceberg in many ways. Talking about a biased, Trump-hating judge. He's talking about Jack Smith being deranged. He calls the DOJ, the people around the special counsel, a gang of thugs, crime-ridden and beyond. This is just a couple things. And I should mention a couple things just this last month, by the way. One of the difficulties, Vita, I'm sure you're seeing is all the different types of indictments facing this president. One is, of course, in Manhattan. One is, of course, in Georgia. You've got Mar-a-Lago. You've got Washington, D.C. So him making a statement, you're going to have to be, as a prosecutor, trying to figure out, are you talking about me? It's like a Robert De Niro taxi driver. Are you talking about me? I don't see anyone else standing here. There's actually 3 other indictments happening right now. How, as defense counsel, do you help to your client? That was a damn good impersonation. You're laughing, but I mean, it was De Niro on a Friday night. Thank you very much. How do you, as a defense counsel, figure out a way to help him in court to say, Your Honor, he's making general statements he's always made even before the indictments?
Well, you know, I don't think he's really listening to his lawyers. But I
think you're right, Vita. I think you're right.
But I will say that, you know, he's presumed innocent. And so I do think he has a constitutional right to say, you know what? the prosecutors are making up stories about me. He could even say that the witnesses are making up stories about me. I know that's not exactly what Jack Smith wants. He wants to limit arguments against the witnesses' credibility, but I think that's just integral to the presumption of innocence, that you should be allowed to say things like, those people are lying.
That makes sense, of course, but then you think about a defamation case, like the E. Jean Carroll lawsuit we know about, right, where he believes that he was simply just denying an allegation, and he's saying the person is a liar. And why is that something that I'm going to be held to account for? It's different in the criminal context, though, you're saying, in the sense of this is somebody who's presumed innocent, as you, of course, are in the civil world. But what are the guardrails? I mean, are there any rules that would apply for a defendant to say what they can and cannot say prior to trial?
Well, it's clear that you can't bribe witnesses, and it's clear you can't threaten witnesses, and you can't obstruct justice, and that's one of the charges he's facing. So you can't do things that would try to interfere with an ongoing investigation. So there are tons of things that he's just not allowed to do, and he can face criminal prosecution. I think one thing that's really interesting here, too, is that his words have already led to this particular judge getting threats and racial slurs. We've seen that there was already a person arrested for doing those things. And we can just look at January 6th and see that his words really have a lot of consequences. And so I think that's going to be what the prosecution's argument is.
Speaking of consequences and words, we know tonight that there are, the special counsel obtained about 32 DMs. One, I wonder who slid into them and whose DMs he slid into. But
it's going to be really interesting.
It is. What are you going to look for? What are they possibly looking for here?
Well, apparently they're looking for this series of DMs between October and January. So right around the time the riots are being planned, right? The insurrection's being planned, right? They want to see who's he talking to, what's he doing, who's he encouraging, right? What's going on here? What's really interesting is they also got in a big fight with Twitter, which wanted to keep it public, tell Donald Trump that his DMs were being sought. Government fought hard to keep that out. The judge agreed with them, and now it's out. Now we know it's happening. It'll be really interesting to see what's in those DMs. If anything, we don't know. Could be totally innocuous, but they did produce 32 of them.
Isn't it crazy to think about, Tia, a man who says he doesn't email, doesn't keep records. He's notorious, and everyone who talks about him, that he is sort of intimating all of his directions and commands, and that you're supposed to extrapolate something more when he says it. That this might be a part of what is being used potentially as evidence?
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting that we think President Trump, we know he had control of his Twitter. I mean, think about that. Most high-level officials are not tweeting. They're not checking their own DMs because their DMs are flooded with foolishness, and they let a low-level staffer, handle all of that. So to think that the government had an indication that Donald Trump himself is DMing people on Twitter, I think is just really, really interesting. And if and when the contents of these DMs come out, it may really be earth-shattering. I guess we'll see.
It's got to be good.
I mean, you got to think about it, but at the same token, I wonder about the slippery slopes of things. You know, every time something like this happens, especially because social media companies, they have been fighting this because they have the privacy concerns. I know that Donald Trump has recently said, or maybe about a year or two ago, that he believes that Twitter was akin to the government, that they could possibly censor the First Amendment, which we know they cannot. I do wonder overall how this is going to play out if this kind of information is allowed to come in. What do you think?
I mean, I just think it's hard to even know what it is that we're looking at. But if it is him planning, the insurrection, as you point out, then I think this is going to be very damning evidence. It's going to be used directly against him.
I just want to interject as like a very online person. We know we're signing our life away when we join these social media sites. You know what I mean? So the fact that my DMs at any given time could be subpoenaed or just leaked or used in some way by a third party that the social media company authorizes, I believe is probably already on the table as it exists. So it doesn't surprise me that much.
And if you put into your DMs,
we hope it never comes out.
That's fine. Tia, I'll call you about that. Vita, Jamil, thank you so much, all of you. Coming up, everyone, the union is warning more auto workers may go out on strike while the companies are hitting back with now layoffs. Next, we're going to go live right to the picket line.